Okay, let's try to be here now. The place where everything happens, but the place that never seems like it's enough. We always think the future is going to be better, but all that is needed for wholeness, for freedom, is in the now. So, loving God, we seek to accept this now, this moment, where you are and where we want to be. We thank you for these sisters and brothers. We come here today seeking wisdom. We ask for your guidance, and we ask that we can be good listeners. We pray gratefully in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, as I told you a few days ago, this talk is now the counterpart to the one we gave you on liberation theology. But in many ways, of the two talks, this is really the more demanding, or if you want to use the word, the more radical. I think the contemplative mind is the most absolute assault on the secular worldview that you can have, because it really is a different mind. And what we've been doing, I think this has been the failure of so much of liberalism, is it has been trying to critique from really the same mind. And that'll make more sense later. But it's still what I'm going to call the calculative mind, or the calculating mind. It's the egocentric mind that reads everything in terms of personal advantage, in terms of usually short-term effect, in terms of what's in it for me and how will I look and how will I look good. As long as you read reality from that small self, and read everything calculatively, I don't think you're going to see things in any really new way. Maybe you'll move along the political spectrum from left to right or right to left. But what all the great religions have talked about is a different way of seeing that is actually a different perspective, a different vantage point, a different starting point. I use often Albert Einstein's quote. He said, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it." Now what we're trying to do is solve our problems by the same consciousness that caused them, which read everything in terms of cause and effect and personal advantage. The word contemplation really only became popular again through really Thomas Merton's writings in the 50s and 60s. Probably a lot of religions use the word meditation. Actually, the word most Christians are familiar with is simply the word prayer. But the word prayer became, unfortunately, in the West, like everything did in the West, became something functional, something you did, again, to achieve a desired effect, which puts you back in charge. As soon as you make prayer a way to get something, and listen to most prayers, that's what they are, and it's okay. I think God's used to it by now. But it's really not any kind of new state or new consciousness. It's the same old consciousness. How can I get God to do what I want God to do? And so maybe I'll talk to him about it, Cure my grandma, well, I guess if he gets enough, he's probably counting, or she's probably counting. How many cure my grandmas do I get? And if I get enough of them, I'll do it. But that's where most people are at with prayer. It's not really a change of consciousness. It's the egocentric self deciding what it needs and what it wants, and resorting to what we now call a higher power, because you can't get any better than that to get on your side, to get what you want. So you can basically remain an untransformed, egocentric person who's just now, instead of manipulating everybody else, which is all the ego can do, is it now tries to manipulate God. Now that's why at least one reason I think religion is in such desperate straits today. Because it really isn't transforming people. It's merely giving people some pious and religious ways to again be in charge and to again be in control. It's still the small self. And what a genuine religion is talking about is a transformed self. It's a different I. Paul uses that wonderful phrase, I live no longer, not I. It's a different I, a different sense of self that's here. I think until you've come to that, you're not at foundational transformation. You might be pious, you might be denominational, you might be religious in the way the term is normally used, you might belong to some group, but it's still what we'll call the small self. Let me use a quote I've been using now for the last 3 years, I think, from Ken Wilber. This is in his set of journal entries called One Taste. And he says, religion has always performed two very important but very different functions. First, it acts as a way of creating meaning for the separate self. It offers myths, stories, tales, narratives, rituals, and revivals that, taken together, help the separate self to make sense of and to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And that's okay. That's how you got to get started. As the psychologist would say, you got to have an ego to let go of an ego. You got to have a self to move beyond the self. But what most religion does is it stops at that first function of simply giving you a positive self-image. That I'm a religious person, or I'm a moral person, or I'm a dedicated person, or whatever it might be. This function of religion does not usually or necessarily change the level of consciousness in a person. It does not deliver radical transformation. It does not deliver a shattering liberation from the separate self. It consoles the self, fortifies the self, defends the self, and promotes the self. I talked to some mediators some years ago who work with major corporations, and they said that they reserve their very best educated people in the work of mediation to work with churches. Because church people tend to be the most opinionated, right? Hard to work with people. They'd sooner work with the business world than with church people. Because church people are all convinced they're right. I mean, that's the whole point of religion, to make sure you're right. And once you start with that starting point, to make sure I'm right, it has disastrous effects. Religion is the worst thing in the world, and it's the best thing in the world at the same time. If it stops at the first function of religion, which I think most religion does, it's the worst thing in the world. All it creates is highly egocentric people, and they have the most clever cover for their egocentricity. They're egocentric for God. They're egocentric for morality, or for the church, or for piety, or for, flag and country, or something like that. They're usually, you can't touch them, because the ego is a hardened silo. It's sure that it's right. Now he says, as long as the separate self believes the myths, performs the rituals, mouths the prayers, embraces the dogma, then the self it is fervently believed will be saved. We're not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but everybody uses the word rather glibly, being saved. I suppose in most Western Christians' mind it means going to heaven. I'm going to get some reward later for doing this. And the whole thing is, I always call it a very bad reward-punishment novel. It's preposterous that anybody believes it, but if you haven't really worked with it, and I'm just lucky enough to have had time to work with it, you believe it because everybody else does. And you think, well, this many people can't be wrong, they must be right. Life is a giant reward-punishment system. And if you jump the hoops right, you'll get the reward. It's not about transformation. Can you feel the difference? You don't have to be transformed. You just have to play the game right. And this is what we're dealing with today. Now he goes on, and he says, religion has also served in a usually very, very small minority. His analysis is pessimistic. The function of radical transformation and liberation. This function of religion does not fortify the separate self, but utterly shatters it. Not consolation, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Now, this is why your great spiritual teachers will always talk about descent, the way of the cross, emptiness, letting go. Not complacency, but devastation. Not entrenchment, but emptiness. Not complacency, but explosion. Not comfort, but revolution. In short, not a conventional bolstering of consciousness, but a radical transmutation and transformation of consciousness at its deepest level. That is what we mean by religious conversion. Now, how that normally happens is by what we'd call a God encounter, where your natural egocentricity is undercut. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. In other words, you have to find a center outside of yourself that is in fact the center. Up to that point, you're eccentric, and you're off-center, and most people are eccentric. You're not the center of the world at all, but you act as if you are. Everything is, do I like it? Do I want it? Do I look good? Is my name on it? You know, who cares? But a lot of people do. That's all they have, you know. It seems like someone took my markers here. You know? Maybe they're in here. Here they are. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is try to give you two different diagrams. So we can understand this. It almost takes a simple imaging of it. And it really is very simple. Maybe you'll even say simplistic. But I'm going to call this the false self. Now, this is, I'm afraid, what we're doing a lot of times is we're baptizing the false self. We're ordaining the false self. We're giving communion to the false self. The false self is this little autonomous thing over here that tries to dress itself up, fortify itself, as we just said, make itself look Christian or Catholic or religious or whatever it wants to be, or moral. Now, people like Jesus come along, and in the presence of that, they say, unless the grain of wheat die, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it will bear much fruit. Or he'll say, the branch cut off from the vine is useless. That's a really strong statement. It's useless. He goes even further. He says, you might as well throw it into the fire. It's a waste of time working with this thing. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. He's largely working with this false self. And the way we start, we all start here, there probably, and God certainly understands this, is we gaze at our navel and see, are we doing it right? And the question always is, how do I get over here? Now, over here, I guess you could call this God, heaven, eternity, the truth, the mystery. And the question is, what are the rules, what are the rituals, what are the practices that I can perform to get God to like me? That's where, in effect, everybody starts. They wouldn't put it in those words, all right? But everybody does. And it's an okay starting place. It's just not a good continuing place. And it's a terrible ending place. Now, I want to right away, because we're going to jump back and forth to understand these, because this is necessary, by the way, to understand contemplation and the contemplative mind, we're going to draw the true self. This is the only self that's ever existed. It's the only self that exists right now. The trouble is, most people don't know it. They really don't. And the work of religion is to get you to know this. Religio, the very word means to rebind, to reconnect. You came forth from God. Your deepest DNA is divine. You are not human beings trying to become spiritual. That's how everybody starts. You are already spiritual beings. And the profound question is how to be human. I believe that's why Jesus came as a human being. Not to teach us how to go to heaven, to teach us how to be a human being here on this earth. Can you imagine how different the history of Western Christianity would have been if we would have concentrated on teaching Christians how to be human beings in this world. Instead of all this heaven talk. Remember I said in the first prayer, it's all about now, about how you do it now. We took all the power out of the now, and we put all the power into the future. Everything was a reward, punishment, was going to happen later. And so now was sort of a game, or an obstacle course, or a testing ground, that you really didn't take it in itself seriously. It's all play acting, and hopefully playing it right so that you get the reward later. So here I have the small self, and you can call it that if you want. Psychologically, Jung would call this the small self, and call this the great self with a big S. When the small self knows that it has no meaning, no foundation, apart from who it is in God, that's transformation. When I live, no longer, not I. You see. That is a different experience of the self. Just as you have a heart transplant, this is an identity transplant. Just as you have a lung transplant or a liver transplant, it is I can't say it's strong enough, it's a different sense of the I. A different sense of the self. A different sense of the who that you are. I always love to say, excuse me, we got to get the who right. Who are we? Who are we? And most people don't know. They think they are this private self. This Richard thing, this Ben thing, this Judy thing, this Susan thing, all of which is fine. But Merton says it so well. He says, one thing for sure about heaven, there won't be much of you there. In other words, the you that you think is you, this little thing, now this is secular consciousness. This is the world we live in today. This is what people, that's all you have. And so you have to dress it up. You have to defend it. You can make a pretty general statement. Whenever you're defensive, it's always the false self. This self is so secure, it never has any it doesn't have any, there's nothing to defend, if you follow me. There's nothing to be offended. And I tell many people, that's how you know you're living in the false self at that moment, if you take offense. At anything. If you took offense in the kitchen at Tepeyac this morning because someone didn't clean up after themselves. I mean, I probably would have too. But don't do it for more than 15 seconds, you know. Because for more than 15 seconds, that's just your little insecure self that needs to be pampered or needs to define itself by cleanliness or whatever it might be, or order, you know. This self is pretty unoffendable. It really is. It's just, I can see why the Bible said, don't let the sun go down on your anger. You'll get angry for a few minutes, but you can't identify with it. You can't feed it. You don't let it possess you, as I said last week. Now, the rules here are sort of the rules of what I'm going to call requirement religion. It's always looking for what are the correct requirements. And every religion is convinced that it has the correct requirements. It forces you toward legalism and ritualism eventually. Here, it's not about requirements, it's about relationship. The quality and your capacity for relatedness. Now, I hope you can see how I'm laying the foundation for contemplation. Because this self will say prayers, but this self is a prayer. Just by walking from here to there, it is a prayer. Now that's why Paul can say something like, pray always. He can't mean walking around saying Our Fathers and Hail Marys, But how you can pray always is when you live in conscious union with God. It's really not, this is the surprise for most people, it's really not about being perfect. this self will still make mistakes, but it lives from a center other than its own. Now, until and unless you've met a centered person, a grounded person who you can tell their center is outside themselves, it's almost hard to get the feel for this. You have to have met a saint. In fact, my definition of Christianity in recent years has been a Christian is someone who's met one. That this whole thing is contagious. Huh? When you meet a person of a certain quality of maturity, that's how you get maturity. Yeah? You meet a patient person and you learn how to be patient. You meet a loving person and you learn how to be loving. That's the way human beings operate. You don't even know how to do it. Huh? And it's the same way with this. When you meet a really grounded, happy, free person, you can just feel the water rise. You become more like that because you'll be satisfied with nothing less. That becomes the reference point or the criteria. This whole thing spreads, like a contagion, really. But it spreads through relationship, by the quality of one's relationship. Now, what we'd say is happening in prayer is you're experiencing that quality of relationship with God, where you know you're not being manipulated, you're not being used, you're not being judged, you're not being evaluated. Boy, who wouldn't go there? I mean, that's just a place of ultimate freedom. That's the state that every one of us wants to live in. So that's why we tell people, go pray a half an hour a day or whatever it might be, because you live in this place. You become this. It's sort of that simple. It rubs off on you. I don't know what other way to say it. So I want to say as strongly as I can that all of the institutes of religion, Bible, sacraments, priesthood, churches, everything, rosary, way of the cross, contemplative, sit, is to help you experience this self. Pure and simple, that's all. And if your religion isn't helping you experience this self, then change it. Or get rid of it, or do something different. If it's maintaining you in this self, then we got a problem. And a lot of religion is. This is the religion that fought Jesus, because it was all into dogmatism and requirements. And when Jesus wasn't following their dogmas and requirements, they had to get rid of him. So if this is about requirement, this is not just about relationship, but it's about right relationship. How do you connect in a way that's really connection? This is about being correct. Do you see? Am I correct? Am I right? I always say you'd think the first commandment was, "Thou shalt be right." It's not about being correct. It's about being connected. Connected. Unless the vine is connected, or the branch is connected to the vine, we have a problem. Now, how does God achieve this? This is the process of transformation. What life will do to you anyway, but most people don't have the freedom to recognize it and to allow it. What life will do to you, and I'm going to use religious language and say God will do it to you. God has to, in the course of your years, destabilize that private ego. The word for that is suffering. Mental suffering, emotional suffering, physical suffering, relational suffering, things that you can't fix, that you can't control, that you can't explain, you can't change. There is no way, and you got to be honest at this point, your ego is not going to give up until it has to. You know that. You know that. It's not, as long as you're goody two-shoes and looking good and feeling good and everybody's admiring you and you're the best Catholic in Oregon, I mean, why would you change? You're feeling quite well without God, thank you. Oh, you're very pious. You're very religious, but you don't really need God. You're admiring your own advancement, your own maturity, so-called, you see. So God has to let you fail. Now, I always say, therefore, there are two people who have a head start in the spiritual life. Or two groups of people, sinners and mystics. Mystics are those who, in this inner journey, consciously let go of those ego boundaries and collapse back in to who they really were anyway, but didn't know it. You are this right now, all right? That's all you've ever been, but hardly anybody knows it, you see. And what you're doing in your contemplative sit is consciously experiencing that. Not knowing it through the head level, experiencing it through the body, gut level. It has to be experienced. You can't teach people this. Even though I'm trying to tell you right now, all right? You won't believe me. You will leave here and live just like you always did until you know this for yourself. And then it's not a matter of belief. I don't believe this. I know this. It's not a matter of, people think religion is believing unbelievable things. It is believing unprovable things. But these things can clearly be experienced. Where you know it. It's the only thing that finally makes sense of what's happening. So the real task, brothers and sisters, is far different. Here we thought it was how to get this over here. The real question is how to get from here to here, where you were anyway, but you didn't know it. So it's all a matter of awakening. It's all a matter of awareness. Now this self is capable of contemplation. That's all. It's that simple. It will now read reality, not from this egocentric position. Remember how I started a few minutes ago? Has to read everything in terms of personal advantage and how do I look? And what will this gain me? This, its center is over here. To use religious language, we'd say we don't look at things through our own eyes, but through the eyes of God. That's the truth. Now it's a more panoramic seeing. It's a broader seeing. It can read reality in the way of wisdom. Wisdom which is broad enough to absorb paradox and contradictions and inconsistencies. If this self is characterized by fragility, and it is, this self is very fragile. And it should be. Anything that doesn't exist should be fragile. This is characterized by abundance. That word has become very popular in recent years, and I think with good reason. And you feel that when you're around a grounded person, a sense of inner abundance, a sense of I've got plenty. They're not grasping, they're not protecting, they're not always needing more and counting how much did you get and how much did I get, which is all this thing here can do. I hope you're starting to see the linkage between this and your politics and economics. I mean, it's everything. And that's why I don't believe much in liberal politics. Because the liberal over here, just because he's put a liberal tag on himself, he really isn't going to be any better. We have all these limousine liberals, who have a liberal politics, but they're still into looking good, having the best of everything. There's no great freedom in being a liberal false self. Do you follow me? This is the freedom. Because here you don't have a lot to protect. Now that's why I said at the beginning, this is the ultimate assault on the secular mind, is religious transformation. These people can't be bought off by any system. They don't need its rewards. They're drawing their life from within. They don't need the perks and privileges and promotions, power, prestige, and possessions, as I used to call them always on my tapes. And if you look at the teaching of Jesus, that's what his warnings are against: power, prestige, and possessions. Not because those things are evil in themselves. That's not the point. They're simply a giveaway that you're still living here. In fact, almost everything you call sin, is really a symptom of sin. The fact that you are grasping and jealous and impatient means at that moment you're living out of this self. You follow me? That's all. It's not if you're grasping and impatient, I'm not going to like you. That's just what most people think inside of the reward-punishment thing. It's just you're not free yet. And those are the indications, the things that we call sin, are the indications that you're not living here. Now, to help you trust this a little more and to be fair about it, I do want to say that life is a dance between the true self and the false self. I don't know anybody, including Mother Teresa, who lives 24 hours a day over here. She probably lived 23 and a half over here, you know. But I worked with her community in Calcutta 4 years ago, right after she died. And you know, I became aware of her little faults too. Thank God, it was such a relief to find out. Even Mother Teresa had little faults, just like you and I do. You know, join the human race. We're all in this together. So she, you know, did this dance too. It's okay to live in the false self. Just, now listen closely, just don't believe it. You follow me? Don't believe this thing. Don't offer it any incense. Don't kiss up to it. And don't expect other people to. Or you'll spend a life of total, you know, upsetness, which is what most people do, just waiting to be upset. Because this thing is living on the edge of upsetness all the time. Huh? In fact, after you've lived here 40 years or so, like when you're my age, it's just, this thing is so, it knows it isn't there yet. It feels that foundational ungroundedness or insecurity. So you'll tend to see people dance faster and faster, become more rigid, become more demanding, more controlling. Most people my age are control freaks. Almost all of them are. Because that's the only way you can feel that some way you're in control, is to take control. This one doesn't, there's nothing to take control of because someone else is much better in control. And you know that experientially. You know that experientially. That someone else is in control anyway. And here the rules are trust and letting go and surrender. They're not about making it right. You don't need to push the river over here. You've got to push the river over there. So, in a certain sense, I always say when I'm teaching this that even me standing here right now, I'm living out of the false self in a certain way. I've got my hat of teacher on, and I'm fulfilling a role. Whenever you've got a role, you take yourself a little more seriously than you really need to. And that's all right. As long as, when this session is over, I can step off my podium and walk out the door and know who I am, apart from being the teacher. Do you see? And I don't need you to kiss up to this, and I don't need to take my own PR too seriously. Now, you've got to know that most people don't know how to do that. Now the spiritual word for that was attachment, that you become attached to this thing, because that's all you've got. Right? And if other people don't like it or talk about it or criticize it, you fall apart or you become defensive or even violent toward them, because that's all you've got, is the defense of this thing that you've concocted and created and is going to die anyway. It doesn't mean a hill of beans. Huh? You know, the first time I was invited to India, they told me something. They wanted me, of all things, to teach the Enneagram. In fact, next month they want me to again. And I'm always surprised, why would the Indian people, with their immense social problems, want to learn about the Enneagram, you know? They said, because you in America, you know everything about personality, and you know almost nothing about essence. They said, but we know a lot about essence, but we don't know much about personality. And I just tell you that to show, they are the Indian culture, which is so ancient. Such a profound sense of this being united. You find it in most native spiritualities too, that we're a part of something. That my life is not about me, I'm about life. And I'm an instance of this great big life. But what happened, especially after the immense intellectual achievements of the West, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific, technological revolution, is we absolutely exploded the individual self. Nowhere has the individual self been so developed as in North America and Europe. Europe even more than here. And in a certain sense. And so I think that's why contemplative teaching is so important here, and also so very, very difficult for us. Because we just can't imagine letting go of this, because this is all we have anymore, you see? And what most self-help programs are today are giving you ways to teach this thing here how to cope. Coping mechanisms, right? Survival mechanisms for the false self. As we say, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, I mean, the whole thing is going down. It's a useless project. Now, as impatient and angry as I get at religion, why I can't give up on religion is because religion, healthy religion, is the only thing prepared to describe the movement from here to here. Right? If you don't use God talk, I mean, why would you give up control? If there was not someone you trusted, that you could give up control too. The secular mind is burdened with creating control freaks. That's all you can produce in secular society. In fact, I always say, you'd be irresponsible not to be, wouldn't you? I mean, you have to see that everything's working, and everything's right, and everything's fixed. And you better, because no one else is going to do it. There's no sense that the universe is on my side, as some saying, that I'm already in the flow, that I don't have to push the river, I'm in the river. I don't have to create the story is happening, and I'm now, the 6 billionth one on the planet right now to be living this story. And what is the story? It's death and resurrection. Every religion is saying that in one sense or another. It's all about death and resurrection and trusting it. Now, Jesus came to live that in a very living icon. Christ has died, Christ is risen. Trust the death, and that breaks you through to the resurrection. Now, this, if you've lived over here, listen closely, if you've lived over here for 40 years or 50 years, and this starts being destabilized, all right? You get your first big suffering at 50, a death in the family or something like that. You're going to fight it with everything you can. You're going to look for somebody to blame. You're going to look for somebody to attack. And it's going to feel like dying. It's going to feel like dying. If you haven't had training in dying, if you haven't had any training in letting go and in trusting a bigger mystery, a bigger process, a bigger benevolence, a bigger pattern, use whatever word you want, you won't surrender to this. You will try even harder to be back in control. And that, I'm afraid, is an awful lot of older people trying even more to stabilize the whole thing and to solidify the whole thing. So this movement, back to who you already were, it will feel like letting go. It will feel like losing. Some have said that what Christianity is really about is how to lose graciously. That's the meaning of the cross. What else would that be a symbol of? How to lose graciously. And if someone hadn't told you how to do that, why would you know? It's not even your fault. Brothers and sisters, that's what we're up against, though, in this Western society. And why I think we're going to see a lot of violence, a lot of people on the attack in various ways, because they don't have any language of dying available to them, of letting go. And so when the letting go is demanded of them, most people are going to look for somebody to blame and going to look for somebody to attack or someone else to change. It'll always be someone else's fault. So now maybe you can understand this passage from John in a whole new way. John 15, whoever remains in me as I in them will bear much fruit. That's what he's talking about. In fact, that's the language of all of the mystics, is the language of union. If it's not the language of union, don't trust it. So as I said before, it's all about getting the who right. And once you have the right who are you? That's the, who are you? And just every day ask it of yourself again, who am I? You're a daughter of God would be the religious language, huh? A son of God. This is really my geometric way of imaging that religious language that we've grown up with. It's not so much what we do, but the who that is acting is what liberates and brings life to the world. I really believe that. Mother Teresa said that also. She said, a person consciously filling a vase with water out of union and love of God is giving more glory to God than a priest at the altar who's standing there in a state of anger or resentment or separateness. It's all about the who, not the what. And we spend all of our time concentrating on what should I do? Which, remember, was the question of the rich young man. What must I do to inherit eternal life? I often have said to people, I don't think it matters what you do. It really, do you see how the whole secular, sacred thing absolutely breaks down? There is no such thing as a secular job. You could be a CEO of a secular institution, and if you're doing it out of conscious, chosen union with God, you will bring more of God's energy and life into the world than a formally professional religious person who's doing it out of a state of anger, judgment, or separation.